Well, buenos dias. Thank you very much. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here. I come from the other hemisphere, but the reality is nutrition issues are far more similar than dissimilar in both places. And so meetings like this really have true global implications. What I'd like to highlight today is an emerging area of science that has been labeled sensory nutrition. And this title obviously emphasizes the role of sensory science and nutrition science, but it's really much more integrative than that. This field draws on biochemistry, physiology, food science, psychological science, certainly statistics, but I'm going to try to focus more specifically on sensory and nutrition. So to set the stage, I should point out that humans have a pretty good arsenal of sensory systems that each is tuned to a different, unique set of stimuli and collectively allows us to sample information from the environments that we inhabit to gather information that can either be an opportunity to promote survival or to recognize threats to that survival and to evoke physiological and behavioral responses to mitigate those. So you can see there are 5 of those senses that are externally facing, looking out in the external environment. But we also have several sensory systems that are monitoring the internal milieu. And each of them functions autonomously, but they also integrate. And in the world of sensory science and nutrition, we recognize that all of those externally focused sensory systems come together. It's the amalgamation, the combination of all of them that create a sensation that we term flavor, which is such an important determinant of food choice. But I think that this new field also emphasizes a new dimension to this amalgamation, and that is that we have to recognize there is important signals stemming from our internal milieu. Sensations like hunger, which is the sensation that motivates the initiation of an eating event and so determines eating frequency. Fullness, which determines the size of a meal, when we stop eating, and so it determines portion size. Those two combined account for total energy intake. But there are also signals from our internal environment for things like nausea and pain and so on, all of which clearly influence flavor as well. So we have to recognize there are external and internal forces driving our food choice. So what are the broader functions of sensory systems? I have chemical here because I focus mostly on the chemical senses, but it's actually true for all the sensory systems. One role is for food safety, right? They help us identify toxins in the environment, potential thermal threats in the environment, dangerous situations. No doubt about it. And it's only the threats that our sensory systems can't detect that really pose the biggest danger. We can't detect botulinum toxin, right? Because we don't have a sensory system targeting that signal. But many of the signals are picked up and we're here, and obviously they're working to some degree. Second, there's an important role and contribution to quality of life. Humans have been deemed a species of sensation seekers. We do many things that make no sense. We jump out of airplanes with a piece of silk over our head. We put a tank of compressed gas on our back and dive under the ocean. We put rubber bands on our feet and jump off bridges. None of those have great survival value. But we do them because we enjoy the stimulation they provide. And food is also a vital source of sensory stimulation. And so sensory science tries to capture that. Reproduction, that's a whole other topic that I won't go into now, but suffice it to say, sensory systems influence everything from mate selection to sperm motility. It's a very compelling story there too, but we're going to focus on nutrition. And the nutrition component is probably most influenced by hedonics. Yes, there are issues with sensitivity and scaling and time course of things, but hedonics is really more closely linked to food choice and nutrition and physiology. So, in terms of hedonics, there's an element of that that's inherent. We are born with a certain predilection to like and dislike certain sensations. You can see here in the upper left an infant's response to a drop of sugar water in their mouth, a facial reaction that indicates pleasure. In contrast, the bitterness in the picture next to that evokes a gaping response and salivation, trying to expel the undesirable sensory stimulus. Sour also not real pleasant. You'll notice salt is not there, and that's because our sensitivity to salt doesn't mature, doesn't manifest for 3 to 6 months postnatally. Umami is a bit neutral in that regard. But there is a recognition now that the sense of taste is not limited to the 5 primary, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, but may actually involve a true taste component to detection of dietary fats. I think the evidence is quite compelling there now, perhaps to starch, and several other sensory qualities. This, in the world of sensory, is a groundswell, a true new area of science that holds a lot of potential, excitement, and relevance. In addition to the inherent component to sensory science, and I would argue more importantly, there is a learned component to it, and that has an impact on food choice as well. The sociologist Kurt Lewin came up with an observation about 80 years ago that I think is very prescient and highly, highly relevant to today, and that is that people like what they eat more than they eat what they like. Yes, we are born liking sweetness. We're born liking the mouthfeel of fat, but we don't eat as much sugar as we possibly can in every eating event that we engage in, or fat for that matter. We learn through dietary experience, through culture, and so on, where those sensations are appropriate and at what levels, and so on. That's learning that drives that. And we can use that knowledge for therapeutic purpose. And indeed, in the United States right now, the government is kind of nudging industry to slowly but consistently ratchet down the amount of sodium in the food supply so that people don't really see what's going on, but they learn to like lower sodium foods. Let me share some science that shows that's the basis for this approach. This was a study where individuals were brought into the lab and they were instructed to add 10 grams of salt to their food every day for several weeks. So they got a very powerful signal of saltiness every time they ate. Another group was given capsules of salt, the same 10 grams. So they got the same metabolic challenge, but not the sensory exposure. And they tracked what their preferred level of saltiness of food was after doing this for several weeks. And what you can see is only the group that was exposed to the sensory high level of saltiness came to prefer higher levels of salt in food. So it wasn't metabolism that drove it, it was the sensory exposure that determined preference. The same story holds for fat. This happens to go in the opposite direction. Put people on a low-fat diet, allow one group to use fat replacers that mimic the mouthfeel of fat. Another group put on the same exact diet, same level of fat reduction, but deprived of that sensory exposure to fattiness. It's only the group that was not allowed to experience the sensation of fat that tracked down and actually came to prefer lower levels of fat in the diet. Can we use this to improve the diet quality of the population? It's an experiment that's underway now. Interestingly enough, the science on sweetness is unsettled science. The best science that I'm aware of now indicates that this phenomenon may not hold for sweetness. There are no changes that have been reported so far, but there are 2 very large clinical trials underway presently. Their findings will come out late this summer or early in the fall. Well, reverse for you, in several months, and we'll see if sweetness really is truly different from fat and salt. But what I want to emphasize for the balance of my time here is how sensory science influences metabolism. You probably are willing to accept that sensory science influences food choice. Yeah, that's pretty intuitive. But less well understood and appreciated is how it affects how we digest food and metabolize the nutrients that food delivers. So one way that this occurs is through a phenomenon called cephalic phase responses. These are physiological responses to sensory stimulation. They're neurally based. They're anticipatory. We need to be able to predict what the consequences will be of putting food in our bodies so that we can physiologically appropriately respond to them. And our sensory systems allow us to do that. So these cephalic phase responses are very small. From a nutritional perspective, trivial even. And they're transient. They occur within 3 minutes of exposure to food, and they're gone within 8 minutes of exposure to food. And as a result, they've generally been ignored. But I think the science is now showing that that little blip, that little sensory signal early on actually has important postprandial, after the meal, implications for how we metabolize nutrients. And so let me share some examples of this with you. I'll kind of walk through the GI tract with you. So we start in the mouth. This was a study that we did in Ghana a number of years ago. We were interested in the cephalic phase salivary response. To what degree does saliva respond to sensory stimuli? And so we had an array of foods. Won't go into why we picked the particular ones that we did, and we gave them to Ghanaians and we gave them to Americans. And I want you to focus your attention on the third bar from the right. That's the one that's most discrepant between the two populations. In America, we know that pickles are sour and we like them, and sour is the most potent stimulus for salivation. And so when we had Americans look at pickles, their salivary flow rate went up. They were anticipating putting a sour pickle in their mouth. In contrast, in Ghana, I'm told, the idea of putting a cucumber in brine, letting it sit there for a long time, and then eating it is just strange and really not food. As a result, they showed a stress response. That is, it suppressed salivary flow rate. So an hedonic-based difference in salivary function. Let's move on to the stomach. These are data from an individual that's brought into the hospital, and on one occasion they're served gruel, oatmeal, and it doesn't elicit much of a response in gastric acid secretion. That's the bottom bar. On another day, they were brought in and they were given a typical hospital meal, and you can see now gastric acid is secreted. And on the third day, they were asked, what's your favorite food? We will give it to you for breakfast. They came in, they were exposed to that, and what you can see is the level of gastric acid secretion is highest yet. And it's not just for gastric acid secretion, it's also for gastric motility as well. So it alters gastric function just based on palatability. Let's move on to the intestine then. This was a very interesting study. This was done in France. And they brought people into the hospital, checked them into a room, and in the room next door, on one day, they grilled a steak. And the people could hear it grilling, they could smell it, and they measured the output of pancreatic exocrine secretion, digestive enzymes. And what you can see I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, early in that graph is there's a little dip there. Actually, there was no change in output of pancreatic secretions. But on another day, they brought the same people in, and instead of grilling a steak, they toasted croissants, a typical preferred food for that population. And what you can see now is rather than no effect, now they're secreting these pancreatic secretions. So it alters the digestion of foods based on culture and palatability. And then one more example, moving out of the GI tract into the periphery. This is some work that we did looking at people that eat chili peppers and like their food very spicy. Those that regularly eat them and like them show an increase in thermogenesis, increase in energy expenditure when they are exposed to that sensory stimulus compared to those that don't eat them and don't like them. And it altered substrate oxidation. This is fat oxidation, and the lower the level indicates greater fat oxidation. So the people that like spicy food have an increase in fat oxidation compared to those that don't. Okay, enough examples to prove the point. But this also brings up the issue of hyperpalatability, which is a buzzword now. And this field of sensory nutrition also allows us to unveil concepts that may lack scientific basis. And this concept of hyperpalatability has gained a lot of attraction in certain circles. But let's talk about the science. What does this term really mean? Is it a valid concept? Well, let me go backwards. First off, let me point out that the underlying basis of hyperpalatability seems to be the level of fat and the level of sugar in food. The studies of this term have revealed that is the underlying basis for hyperpalatability. But I would point out that just knowing how sweet something is or how fatty something is really gives you very little information about how much somebody's going to like a food. No more likely than knowing that your favorite color is red is going to determine what kind of paintings you like, right? It's a single dimension. Food is a much more complex stimulus for individuals. It has cultural meaning. It has a wide array of inputs rather than single dimensions. And this hyperpalatability just focuses on one or two single dimensions. Second, the degree of liking is not concentration dependent. It is not a monotonically increasing function. These are very typical sensory data for individuals rating the preferred level of sweetness in lemonade. And what you can see here is that there are some people that like very little sweetness in their lemonade, some that like middle levels, and some that like very high levels. This concept that hyperpalatability is an approach used by the food industry to attract people to overconsume food and to increase sales just cannot have a scientific basis. Which consumer are they designing their product for? It can't be all of them because they all like a different level of sensory stimulus, right? So there is no single combination of ingredients that has this property of hyperpalatability. Third point to mention is that preferred flavor qualities differ cross-culturally. What the diet in Chileans incorporates is different from what they eat in Bangkok and what they eat in Paris, right? We all have different cuisines, and we prefer our own cuisine because it's familiar to us. And so it's not a property of the food, it's a property of the culture. Next, food preferences change over the life cycle, right? Our sensory systems, by and large, stay intact, but the intense flavors that adolescents like are not as appealing to the elderly, right? It's not that the food changed, it's our life cycle, our learned experiences and so on have changed. So, and I already pointed out the importance of frequency of exposure previously for preferred salt and fat level. So the bottom line here is that palatability is not a property of a food. Palatability is a characteristic of an individual, your life experience. So to talk about hyperpalatable foods is not to put any onus on the food itself. It's to recognize cultures, different people are different, and we have to focus on that rather than demonizing foods. And my final example draws on this interoception, because that's a dimension that I think we have not appreciated up to this point. And let me describe an experiment that highlights this. What we did is we brought people into the lab on 4 occasions, and they actually saw a live demonstration, not the video that I'm showing you here. And we told them that clear solution is their gastric acid. And the red solution was a fruit-flavored beverage that they were going to consume. And so when they consumed it, that beverage was going to mix with their gastric acid, And when it did so, the contents of their stomach would be a liquid, just like that. Everybody said, sure, that makes sense to me. I can see that. And then on another day, we brought them in and we said, you're going to drink this beverage today, but when it hits your gastric acid, it's going to instantaneously turn into a solid. Right? And they watched this demonstration and thought, oh my goodness, somehow they figured out how to do that. All right, and then on a third day, they were brought in and they were told, you're going to eat something solid today, but when it hits your gastric acid, it's going to dissolve within seconds. And so, in fact, it will be a liquid in your stomach. Right? And they watched that demonstration. And for symmetry, of course, we brought them in on another day and we said, okay, you're going to eat something solid today, but when you do, it is not going to be affected by your gastric acid. It's going to stay a solid in your stomach. And they saw that demonstration. Of course, what really happens is it's always a liquid in their stomach. But they thought it was going to have a different physical form in their stomach. So how did that influence them? First off, when they came in and consumed these different stimuli, when it was a solid, they said, oh my goodness. When they thought it was going to be a solid in their stomach, they thought, oh my goodness, I can feel it. It's happening. It's a solid in my stomach, right? And we asked them about how hungry they were afterwards. If you focus, I think, on the histogram rather than the graphs, it's more obvious. The black bar is the condition where it was liquid external stimulus and liquid in their stomach, and the cross-hatched on the far side is when it was a solid outside and a presumed solid inside. And what you can see is that when people thought it was going to be a liquid in their stomach, they said they were hungrier for hours after consuming it and less full. And that translated into change in energy intake over the day. When they thought it was going to be a solid in their stomach, they ate less total energy on those days. And it changed gastric emptying. When they thought it was going to be a liquid in their stomach, it emptied from their stomach more quickly. And when they thought it was going to be a liquid in their stomach, total GI transit time was faster than when they thought it would be a solid in their stomach. And when they thought that it was a liquid in their stomach, it changed the entire release, the profile of gastric hormones that presumably regulate appetite, gastric flow, and digestion. Insulin was changed, ghrelin was changed, GLP-1 was changed, this new drug, right? All of those are changed just by the expectation of the physical form of a food in your stomach. And I think this has relevance. One of the issues that we are concerned about in terms of the obesity problem is that people are consuming a very large amount of energy in beverages, particularly sugar-sweetened beverages. Everything that I just showed you would indicate that a beverage is a less effective stimulus for evoking sensations of fullness. We can consume very large quantities of these beverages and as a result take in large amounts of energy from them. There is a physiological basis for the observation of high beverage consumption and the potential complications of that. So, in summary, there is this emerging new field of sensory science that puts together sensory systems, sensory science that is typical in the food industry, and a field called psychophysics, the physiological responses to sensory stimulation, to gain better understanding of how we can make foods healthier in the future. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.